All right, so in this video, I was going to share with you some absolutely joyful, heartwarming, and completely uplifting ideas on how identity politics is more often than not an exercise in emotional manipulation, a deep expression of mental illness, and an exemplary example of a serious lack of personal responsibility. And I think individually, on a functional level, we need to understand really kind of where the rubber hits the road and the appeal of many of these ideas that, or especially over the last few years. It's mostly a form of emotional violence and covert emotional manipulation, which is odd because oftentimes these are people who are standing up for injustice and all about equality and tolerance and compassion and empathy and all of these virtuous things, which we all probably want and probably agree with. And we can all agree that there are a lot of problems in the world. And I can just say personally, a lot of what people say in this realm, I actually do agree with, because obviously there are a lot of problems in the world. Historically, there have been. And in many ways, we can do a lot better as a society and as a culture. Of course, I mean, there's really no denying that. And I don't know why anyone would try to do that. That really doesn't make much sense at all. But it's more so getting back to the point here is that oftentimes on an individual level, most of the time, this is just a form of emotional violence and covert manipulation. And I think also the vast majority of the time that individuals don't actually really care about whatever issue they say they care about, because oftentimes they're not really doing much of anything. And they're not really set. Like, my point is, it's really easy to take a strong moral position when you have no skin in the game. It requires no sacrifice, no personal inconvenience to you, really, and there's really no risk to you. So you're kind of in a situation where you're isolated from a lot of consequence, a lot of circumstances, and maybe even you're rewarded for doing it. So in that way, it's obviously very easy and very convenient. It's more so what people do when it isn't easy, when it isn't convenient, when no one is looking, when no one's around and you're by yourself. That's oftentimes where the rubber hits the road with a lot of these things. So getting back to the point, it's a way for mentally unwell individuals to compensate for their internal instability while simulating forward motion, when in reality, they're just jumping from one hamster wheel to another hamster wheel, just spinning, running in circles, and then be like, oh, well, that didn't work, so I'm gonna do this one. Now I'm running in circles and just constantly jumping around, feeling like, oh, I'm making progress. When in reality, it's a facade, it's a simulation, it's not really progress. The vast majority of the time, of course, there's exceptions. And on a functional level, it gives a person with an already weak or deficient identity the illusion of finding themselves and self-exploration, and also gives them oftentimes a sense of belonging to, whatever group they might be subscribing to, or whatever label they're subscribing to. Now they belong to that, and they feel like, oh, I know who I am now because I belong to this group, and I was this, but now I'm this. So get this hit of dopamine, and that makes me feel like, oh, I'm making progress, and I belong, I know myself. When in reality, it's just one hamster wheel to the other. And isn't it also odd how the vast majority of these kinds of groups that people really subscribe to and feel a sense of belonging to oftentimes end up with a significant amount of infighting and a significant amount of subdivision, meaning people get into the group and then they don't even agree with each other in the group, so they subdivide, they subcategorize, and it just becomes a whole other thing. New acronyms, new slogans, new jargon, new vernacular, and then it just kind of repeats the process, again, simulating forward motion. And again, another thing that it really offers people is gives them a preformed explanation for any inconvenience or any perceived negative situation that they come across. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about extreme feminism or we're talking about extreme, like, red pill men's rights kind of guys. They're walking into situations with all these already preformed. It's kind of like their guns already loaded. They got a full clip, and they're just basically waiting for an opportunity to use it. And basically, it gives them a sense of empowerment, it gives them a sense of identity, gives them a sense of life makes sense, life is orderly, which to many people is very alluring, even if it's completely false and misguided and harming them and harming other people in the long run. And I think it's also mostly just a form of covert emotional manipulation because it gives the person an ability to always demonize and diminish any opinion, view, person, or group that they come across that they don't like because of the thing they subscribe to and all the identity, all the investment. They have all these subcategories and subdivisions they can always retreat to, and an easy way to shoot other people down when they encounter something they don't like or don't agree with. It gives them an infinite shade of gray to continue to divide and subdivide and go and basically get into all these contexts which have oftentimes no objective basis, no logical validity, no real rationality aside from feeling or aside from someone being evil or someone being a victim. That's pretty much it. And it allows a person to really hide their internal pollution behind virtuous words and slogans, which again, to sum it back up again, is the whole thing is most oftentimes an exercise in emotional manipulation, mental illness, and a serious lack of personal responsibility. And just in closing, on a practical note and a more positive note, I think personally pragmatism, logic, critical thought, and many other metrics of being a somewhat rational and somewhat intelligent human being are oftentimes completely devoid in these circles. And I think regardless of which one of these things we might belong to or not, I think cultivating and developing these things would very likely improve our lives and improve our situation and give us many of the things that we're looking for in the sort of false places. It's like growing up eating junk fast food from like a gas station and you think that's food, but in reality you're still always hungry, you're always seeking because you're completely internally devoid. But then if you can actually eat real food with real sustenance that actually works for your metabolism, you'll naturally find that things will change and shift and you'll probably feel differently and see things differently. And I think in many ways pragmatism, logic, critical thought, being somewhat rational, trying to be a somewhat more intelligent human being and considering a variety of views without getting fixated on one or the other is something that we could probably use more of moving forward, especially as more and more people will absolutely for sure be completely losing any sense of reality, any sense of logic, rationality, any sense of conversation, any sense of dialogue. And we're just going to be seeing a lot more of this mental illness epidemic that has really gained so much exponential momentum over the last few years. And I think the whole popularity and gaining popularity of this whole thing is really large in part a cause and a reflection of the growing mental illness epidemic that is really has its roots in the United States, but is really spreading across the world at this point because of the interconnected nature of social media and everything else. But really the hotbed of it is absolutely America. And I would say the hotbed of the hotbed is probably Portland, Oregon, in other cities on the West Coast where these ideas really kind of have a lot of momentum and a lot of energy behind them, let's say. And I think going forward over the next 5 to 10 years, this will likely be one of the biggest causes for many people completely losing any grasp on tangible, real reality. And I think we've already seen that. If you look at how things have changed over the course of 2020, over the last few years, large in part, this plays a huge role in that. And I would really want everyone to think about and ask, is it a coincidence that more often than not, people who are heavily into identity politics, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, usually suffer from many mental illnesses and afflictions, while oftentimes being heavily reliant on therapy and or psychiatric medications? Is that a coincidence or is it not? Do these things go together? Are they part and parcel? Is it chicken or the egg? Is it Is the therapeutic in these kinds of industries over the last few years just basically incubating and putting a lot of these ideas out there? I'll let you investigate that for yourself.